Welcome everyone to the February 23rd City Council work session. Welcome to everyone here and at home. Let's see. This agenda has been amended to reflect the reordering of items 3 through 5 for the 7:30 meeting. So you have time to think about that one. Okay.
Yeah.
So first up is the review of the 2014 implementation of bond measures. City Manager.
Thank you, Mayor, and I'll just turn over to Kurt.
Okay, thanks very much. So as you become accustomed to, once a year we come in and give you an update as to where we stand with the pavement bond measures. This year represents actually the first year of the implementation of projects under the second bond measure. But just as by way of high-level history, in November of 2008, Eugene's voters actually approved a 5-year bond measure of about $35.9 million to repair streets. 2 years later, in November of 2012, the Eugene voters renewed that measure at $43 million for additional 5 years. And as you recall, each of those bond resolutions contained some specific provisions, including that the bond funding will be used for a specific list of projects, that an outside auditor will be engaged to provide an opinion as to assurance that the bond money was used in accordance with the resolution. In other words, how we said the money was going to be spent. And finally, that a street repair review panel would be appointed to advise the city manager and specifically to provide a report separate from that of the auditor with the citizen's opinion as to the appropriate use of the bond funding. So again, today's work session is to give you the citizen panel's report of the 2014 project, to present the results of the auditor's findings, and then we'll talk briefly about the most recent update to the pavement management report. As we note each year, as we get into the jaws of the construction season, oftentimes trying to get around town becomes a laborious undertaking, and we wonder if the work is ever going to be completed. Once the work is done, memories seem to be fairly short, and now where were we last summer? So just as a reminder, the Whitaker had some work last summer. We were on First Avenue between Madison and Monroe. 13th Avenue was reconstructed from Garfield to Washington Street. We worked on parts of 43rd Avenue, North Shasta Loop, Furland Boulevard, part of Broadway downtown, the Coburg Road Viaduct approaching the Ferry Street Bridge, Good Pasture Loop, and a number of bike and pedestrian improvements, including 3 additional rapid flashing beacons, those being at First and Monroe, on Green Acres Road east of Applewood, and the what we refer to as the Hawk signal, upgraded crosswalk on East 30th near University. All of those projects are covered in a lot greater detail in the report from the panel, but just kind of reminisce as to where we spent time in 2014. In your packet is the results of the findings from the financial auditor, and this year there are actually 2 separate reports from the auditor. The reason for that is that the remaining approximately $1.1 million residual from the 2008 bond measure was spent in 2014, and then about $8.4 million of the 2012 measure was spent in 2014. Therefore, we asked the auditor to provide an opinion on separate opinions on, as to the use of the funding under each of those measures. I would point first, I think, to the well, I guess I can conclude on the auditor's findings. I think those become not the most exciting reading, but as you leaf through the 4 pages, I think the wording that becomes important is that quote, the city followed the purpose and limitations of city council resolutions related to the measures, and the second quote is that no exceptions were noted. So in other words, the audit based on the limited review of about 50% on the 2008 measure and about 68% on the 2012 measure was clean. Then the report from the citizen panel that's also in your packet. Just a brief overview on the Street Repair Review Panel report and its membership. This is an 11-member citizen group, originally appointed in 2009. We have 6 of the original members still staying with us in the 6th year of the program now. I believe I saw Allie Camp in the audience, and she is on the newest member of the panel. I don't believe any others made it tonight, but the group met 3 times over the winter in the process of developing their current report. Just a few of the highlights of the findings. Panel unanimously concluded, which in line with their purpose for being a panel, unanimously concluded that the bond proceeds were used appropriately. Beyond that, they make some notes that you will find comments on in their report. They note the progress that's been made on street repairs in Eugene. Specifically in 2014, an additional 18 lane miles of roads were repaired. They noted that 2014 was actually kind of the kickoff of implementing the prioritized list of projects from the Bike Ped Master Plan, from which we receive input from the bicycle groups. And they also note again the economic impact of the program, and for 2014 estimated that 92 full-time construction jobs were directly created as a result of this particular program. They also noted the continual focus on sustainable practices that we've been pursuing for a number of years. Noted that the improving economic conditions overall are bringing our estimated cost of the work closer in line with the actual costs that the contractors are delivering those for. You might recall in the first measure, we were able to add a significant number of projects based upon down economy and very favorable bid prices. We're not finding that, at least in the first year. So it's not necessarily good news, bad news. That's a data point. Estimates are closer to reality as of today. Also commented on the continuing decline in the backlog of deferred maintenance, which then kind of brings us to the 2015 pavement management report that we've also provided you a copy of. In the report, you'll see that the current backlog now stands at $84 million. It's hard to sit here and say that's good news, but it's certainly good news compared to where we were a few years ago. Absent this particular program, we estimate that the backlog would have stood at about $280 million today. So almost $200 million of avoided cost by virtue of moving ahead in the manner in which you all have. You'll find in the report that the arterial collector system condition overall has improved significantly, and almost half of the current backlog of deferred maintenance relates to local residential streets. The downward trend in the backlog is expected to continue through the life of this bond measure. If other funding or renewal of this measure isn't put in place, however, we would estimate that the backlog would then balloon back to about $173 million in 10 years without sustaining the effort. So the message there, I suppose, is that good news is that we've made significant progress on a significant problem. The other part of that is that the work is not complete, and we need to continue the effort. I always like to take the opportunity at this session to really acknowledge that the success of this is a shared responsibility. You know, I'm certainly honored to make the report and privileged to deliver what's usually pretty good news to you, but there are a lot of players involved with this. You know, I begin with the council through the courage and determination to take on this program in the first place at a time when, as you recall, in 2008 was not the easiest time to talk about money measures, but you did it. The voters of Eugene have adopted not only the first measure, but the second measure by very comfortable margins, without which we would not have the program either. I salute the finance staff and the Central Services Department for squeezing every possible nickel out of the bond measures to put that into work on the ground that could possibly be done. The Public Works Engineering staff, just incredible design and construction management efforts, sustainability focus, in their collaboration with other agencies who have become involved with what is a pretty complex series of projects around town every year. And I'll mention the utility companies, and especially Webb, who, as we work with them, there's no question that they have their hands full. They have worked extremely hard to stay ahead of our projects and often reprioritize their own work to make sure that these projects work for the community. And I am certain that they have deferred some work that would have been a higher priority for them in order to make all these things happen. Local contractors continue to do an exceptional job, both with the workmanship and with their customer service. And virtually all of the work that we did in 2014 was delivered by local contractors. And then last but certainly not least, our street repair review panel, including folks like Allie, have become very helpful, critical of the program, provide input as to where we go. They become wonderful sources of information to the community and have become a kind of a satellite public affairs group for us, and we greatly appreciate that. 2015 sizes up as another busy year, and I won't talk about those projects, but they are identified in the materials that you have, and they're now posted on the website. So with that, just note that there's no action necessary on this. It's purely an informational report, but we're here to answer questions should you have them.
Thank you. Got Chris, Claire. Okay, I just wanted to start this out by appreciating the work that's been done. I'm not had this long enough situation that I feel like it's too much to be inconvenienced in the summer. I'm fine with being inconvenienced in the summer to have roads that are really functional and useful for the community. I'm happy the auditing report was not exciting. That we did what we said we would do. That's kind of the basis of this whole thing, so I'm appreciative of that. And I'm really appreciative, and I think we're going to have more conversations in the next item on our agenda about how we continue to be innovative in our construction work in terms of reducing emissions and really moving the dial on some of our council goals. So I'm very appreciative of that. And I think that the benefit of having these jobs and the number of them during the recession was really an important thing for our community as well. And I hear you that the ongoing funding issue is still looms out there for us, because I think to some degree people really feel that these two bond measures were taking care of a really desperate need to fix our roads, and it's a whole other question about how we get equilibrium. So that's just out there for us to keep dealing with. And I appreciate the local contractors, and I just want to encourage anybody who's listening to this on television or the web that we get lots of questions all the time about what's being fixed and where it is, and all that can be found online, what we've gotten done, what it is, where it is, and also what we're looking to in the future. So I hope people will make use of that information. I appreciate that it's there. Thank you very much. Chris, you're next.
Thank you. Looking to see if you had a three-legged stool over there.
I could bring you one.
You could bring one. Really, all I can say is wow. One of the things when I first got on the council that was really high on my list was the fact that we had such a significant transportation challenge. So many streets were not being fixed. The can was being kicked down the road year after year. And when Alan and I served on the Transportation Funding Committee, when we first got on, we were almost overwhelmed by how huge and insurmountable this problem seemed to be, which is why I'm doubly impressed that we have made so much progress. To get from at that time, almost $200 million. By now it would have been $280 million. Down to 84, to me, is incredible, absolutely incredible. And it's not just the fact that we've used the generosity of the voters to be able to finance it, but also the smart techniques that we've put in place. Some of the sustainability and reuse and construction systems that we use have really squeezed the maximum dollar out of them, and staff deserves a lot of credit for being innovative in that way too. It gives you like double benefit for the dollars. With that said, I still am very conscious of the fact that we are in a position of kind of having to rub our stomach and pat our head at the same time, because the street replacement and repair, the backlog, is one part, but the ongoing maintenance is the other piece. And if we fail on that piece, it creates the backlog that we're working to solve right now. So we may pass another bond measure, get rid of the backlog entirely, but if we fail to support the ongoing operations and maintenance, we'll just rebuild the backlog. So what we have to commit ourselves to is getting that backlog eliminated and then not letting it rebuild itself by supporting operations and maintenance. And that's, I think, the commitment that is most important to stress. We as a city have to say our transportation infrastructure is fundamental, and therefore we have to be willing to commit the resources to ensure that it stays operational and doesn't start gradually sliding off again. And I know that's a difficult choice because there's many different things we have to consider on that. But to me, this is one of the fundamentals. And you have done an extraordinary job, and I would hate to squander that by not maintaining that going into the future. So whether I'm on council or not, the council that comes after me has to be willing to commit to keeping that operations and maintenance supported so we don't ever get into this backlog position again, because that would be poor thanks for the hard work that you've done.
Claire?
Yeah, thank you. I, too, am full of praise. So I want to echo a lot of what the mayor said in particular. And I also really want to thank the members of the Citizen Review Panel. This report that was put together collaboratively, I'm assuming, but is from the Citizen Review Panel, is really accessible. I really appreciate the definitions, explaining some of the technical detail while still letting people know where the repairs have been done, because I think makes it very accessible to the general public and then also very informative for people who want to dig a little deeper and get some context for what we're doing with the bond money or our roads or any of those kinds of things. And I think, as the mayor pointed out, it's available online as well. My only small quibble was the designation of the First Street, Madison Street, and Monroe Streets as projects that were done in downtown, because I don't live in downtown, and those projects were all around my house. So if we're going to be technical, it was in Whitaker. But it's a quibble. So, you know, this can be a dry topic to some people, road bonds, paving repairs, contractors. But obviously it's really vital to the daily life of pretty much everyone in town. So I really appreciate the due diligence and the work that happened. And I also want to thank the voters and the council, which put this bond measure out to the voters, and the accountability pieces in there before I joined the council. So I want to thank everyone for crafting a bond measure that really resulted in this work and the transparent process by which we're getting it done. I think it's been a really great achievement for the community. So I just wanted to note that. Thank you.
Alan?
Yeah, well, you know, when we first started this effort, our campaign motto for the first bond, I believe, was drive around. Because if you drove around, you'd see how bad shape our roads were, and I think it's obvious that we needed to pass something and do this bond, and we've done such a good job that the second bond was actually, I believe, passed by a higher margin than the first bond. So. And what we set out to do was bring that backlog down. And Chris, you mentioned it, and so did the mayor. You know, it's now down to $84 million. If in the absence of this, it would have been $280 million. So we are doing exactly what we intended to do. And big credit, Kurt and the Public Works Department, for all the stuff that you've done. Job well done, very good. And I think the second bond being a higher margin was a large credit to the way you did the first one. And I think the lessons learned from all of this, from my perspective, were if we're clear, if we make a list and we stick to it, and we have accountability mechanisms, and we spread the the benefits around the city, people respond to that because that's a good formula for how why this was passed, and I was real eager to make sure that that happened the first time we went around. I did have one question. You didn't quite mention part of what we did was also to add money for bike lanes and bike paths and walking paths. And can you talk a little bit about that and what we've done and in improving that part of our system too?
Sure. The 2012 bond measure identified an average of $516,000 per year to be spent on bike ped facilities. The projects themselves were not listed specifically in the resolution because they will rely on input from BPAC, GEARS, and other groups as we look to implement the bike ped master plan. So the last year's projects included a number of sidewalk improvements, number of crosswalk improvements. It included the 3 rapid flashing beacon or hawk signal improvements in part that I had mentioned earlier. I believe the total expenditure for 2014 was somewhere in excess of the $516,000 average. So over the 5 years of the program, there will be a little over $2.5 million spent on those types of improvements.
And looking forward, we looked at the bike ped master plan that we had, and I think if we, at the current funding rates, it would be about 100 years for that plan to get fully developed and funded. And maybe when we look at that plan in context, which was done, I think, after the second one was passed, but when we, or right around the same time, maybe the next one we think about how that plan can be part of this, and maybe move that forward and maybe knock down the backlog of that from 100 years. Maybe we can knock it down to like 50 years or something like that to get it fully funded. And then the other part is, can you talk about, we're going to have a rail quiet zone work session coming up in a couple of weeks, and one of the options for that to fund those projects is to put them in the bond, the road fund bond. And I think Salem did something similar where they did that. Can you speak to that possibility?
Sure. I'm going to take just a second and respond to the bike ped master plan issue that you had. Just mention that as we visit with the street repair review panel about bike ped projects, there's an acknowledgement that those types of projects lend themselves to a greater degree to soliciting outside funds, grants, or other sources. And so one of the strategies would be to use the $516,000 a year to the extent possible as seed money to do more work than would otherwise be possible, because I think everyone recognizes that the bike ped plan, I think with an estimated $60+ million project list, would take a long time at $500,000 a year to implement. So that was acknowledged by the group, and that it's, by comparison, more difficult to find grant funding for overlay work and that type of thing. So those conversations are out there. With regard to the quiet zone, yes, it's true, and Tom Larson will give you as much agonizing detail as you would like on the 9th of March, but the City of Salem did implement their quiet zone by incorporating into a street repair bond measure similar to ours.
And we could do the same. Well, we'll hear more about that on the 9th. So there's a couple of $1 million that we need to come up with in order to make that work.
Yeah, it'll be
kind of more or less have to do it all at the same time. Otherwise, you get a quiet zone in 5 years. Big deal. That's not the plan that I would like to see happen. But
yeah. Yeah, and I think Tom will be sharing some numbers and strategies and visiting with you about previous direction that the council has given on quiet zones, and talking about different ways to approach it in a different manner.
That's on March 9th.
So I think I don't have anybody else in the queue. I just wrap it up by reminding everybody who's listening here that what we're working hard on is building a good multimodal system, one that will accommodate everybody, and certainly sidewalks are a huge part of how people get around and really need that same kind of attention that the rest of the system needs. We have to think about them all together all the time and try to integrate how we plan about it so that we are moving everything along. I think that's what Alan's alluding to, too. So anyway, thank you very, very much. We like a good news presentation.
Good news.
Yep, thanks for your time.
And you know that you didn't always get to give good news ones, so that's good. All right. Next up is our second work session of the evening. That's a climate recovery proposal.
I'll turn over to Babe and her team to make the presentation.
Welcome.
Entire team.
Go team.
Hello, Mayor, Councilor. Thank you for having us here. I'm going to put a PowerPoint up here on the wall. You have many of the same graphics right in front of you on the handout. Did everybody get that, the color handout? So if craning your neck is uncomfortable, this has the same images. And then you also have a progress report which has the same graphics in a little greater detail. So just a reminder, this is an update. We're not asking you to make any decisions at this time. I'm going to take just a few minutes. I'm going to try and keep it under 10 minutes. Quickly review the climate recovery ordinance and what's included in that, and then just review the assessment of current trends and tell you a little bit about what's coming next. I will try not to speak too quickly, but if I get going too fast, please say that. I sometimes will go too quickly. So really briefly, a reminder of the climate recovery ordinance that you all put in place in July 2014. To my knowledge, there's only one other city in the country that has placed their carbon goals in ordinance, in local law, and it's really remarkable to be out on the front edge, I think. We're a leader among cities our size in taking steps like this. So the ordinance clarifies and codifies the existing goals that we already had on the books to reduce community-wide fossil fuel use 50% by 2030 and to see our city operations become carbon neutral by 2020. You've received the climate recovery, it also calls for an assessment of current efforts, which is why we're here today. The progress report in front of you contains that information. Included in that progress report are some highlights, and I'm going to just touch on a few here really briefly to remind us all that we are taking a number of steps to reduce both internal and community-wide energy use. There's plenty going on. I also want to make the comment that I'm going to give you a handful of examples, but there are many, many more that we could add here. On the internal side, this is the glam shot of some heating equipment inside the Holt. It's very exciting. But it uses a tiny amount of fuel compared to comparable systems, and we've done energy retrofits across the organization that are helping us use less energy. We are queuing up right now a project to replace street light lamps with LEDs, which will cut our electricity use significantly. Many of you are familiar with the warm mix asphalt process that's being used here locally, really pretty extensively. It reduces the amount of energy that goes into creating the asphalt. It also keeps down the emissions so that the workers in the area are less affected by smoke around in their work zone. And as you know, we were queuing up the construction of a new city hall that will be highly energy efficient. So there are things on the internal side. And then going over to the community side, a number of things there as well. We've seen a lot of downtown redevelopment, and sometimes the connection to climate change isn't very simple. But we've added people living in downtown. We've added services living in downtown. And this means a higher proportion of our population can meet their regular needs without relying on a car. They can walk down to the corner and go see a movie and get dinner and get groceries, and that actually has a huge effect on reducing our overall emissions, especially those associated with transportation. So the downtown redevelopment that's being done is really a step in the right direction. Similarly, those folks over at LTD are doing a bang-up job of delivering us a really great bus system. And the BRT system that we have is, as you all know, it's really a leader, especially for a community our size, and it's only being expanded. So great moves there. We have a Love Food Not Waste program that's being spearheaded by the city, which allows restaurants and grocery stores and commercial institutions to compost the organic waste that they're producing through their work. And by taking that organic waste and composting it instead of putting it in the landfill, we reduce the amount of methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas that goes into the atmosphere. So we're keeping greenhouse gas emissions down that way as well. And finally, Eugene, the city of Eugene is a supporter, among others, of the Bring Rethink Business program that goes out and helps individual businesses find out ways to reduce energy use, to reduce waste, and to manage stormwater treatment better, among other things. So we are doing a number of things on the community side that help us go the right direction. A reminder, these are just a few examples. There are many more, but I'm going to carry on and hit a few more highlights of what the ordinance is requiring us to do. It calls for the development of a science-based community greenhouse gas reduction goal. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but just to remind you that is one of the things that we'll be doing and coming back to you after your summer break. It calls for regular progress reports to council, not unlike this one. And it establishes a process of analysis, reporting, and readjustment if community or internal targets are not met. So with that reminder, I'm just going to hit really briefly on our internal energy use trends and then our community energy use trends. So on the internal side, I'm going to share with you a greenhouse gas inventory that was conducted by city staff in 2010. You're just seeing a piece of it there, but I'm going to give you the full picture as we go. Internal greenhouse gas emission sources, there are a few large chunks. Your progress report has greater detail here, but just to remind you of the big pieces. Transportation, our fleet vehicles that we operate for city operations are about 8% of the total piece of the pie. And then when we go to heating buildings and heating swimming pools, street lights and the like, so electricity use and natural gas use, that's about 30% of the total pie. And then the big piece that's a little more difficult to measure, but the estimates indicate our supply chain is somewhere on the order of 57% of our total greenhouse gas emission sources. That's not necessarily intuitive, so I'm going to take just a second and break that down. The supply chain, the big ones here are road construction. So when we put down concrete, for example, there's a huge amount of natural gas that goes into baking limestone in order to make cement that goes into the concrete. And when we count that up, those emissions that go into making concrete, that concrete has a large footprint. When we buy a vehicle, like a city vehicle, the fuel that we use to operate that vehicle is captured in transportation, but the energy that goes into mining the iron ore and then melting it down and creating that car or vehicle, whatever we're using, is substantial and falls into that supply chain. So there are a whole bunch of things that we use as part of mission critical activities that fall under that supply chain wedge. So the next graphic that I'm going to show you is trends over time, and it's important to note that the supply chain wedge is not illustrated in these trends on the next slide, and that's really largely due to it's just harder to track these emissions. They're harder to calculate, and so it's not as easy as just looking at a meter and figuring out how much we've consumed. So looking at the overall trends, again, this is for internal operations. The top line red there is natural gas. The black one, the next one down, is transportation fuel. The blue one is electricity. And at the bottom, you'll see our steam consumption, which was used for heating the Holt Center and City Hall. That stopped in 2012. So some of that's been offset into natural gas. The trends here, they were increasing over time. Our transportation fuel was increasing about 1% per year till about 2012 and has now flattened out. Natural gas use, that line is pretty wobbly, but similarly has flattened out. Incidentally, that volatility in the natural gas use has a lot to do with temperature changes and just different temperature winters harsher winters, we use more natural gas to heat buildings. So it's important to note that while we made some really decent improvements in our energy use, we're clearly not quite on track to meet those aggressive greenhouse gas reduction targets. And then finally, I just want to make a point that we'll be coming back to you after your summer break and talking with you about the actions that will be queued up to get us in track to meet these targets. And next, I'm going to go to the community side. So you're going to see two charts that are the same idea, but looking at community energy. So this is a inventory that was conducted by Lane Council of Governments in 2010, looking community-wide. So all of Eugene, actually this is metro-wide, so the Eugene Springfield metro area is all included in here. When we look at the total pie, the relative wedges we expect to be about the same. So even though we're including Springfield in here, we don't think that really shifts things too much, and we don't have a comparable greenhouse gas inventory for just Eugene. So we're using LCOG's inventory here. So again, looking at the building slice is somewhere around 11% of the wedge. So that's again heating buildings, heating homes, lighting homes, and the like. When we look at local transportation, it's about 31% of the total pie. And then again, looking at the community-wide, when we look at the embodied energy, that's what we call, or embodied emissions, those emissions that are used to create things that we use, it tends to be a pretty large piece of the pie. So similarly, it's about 58% for the community-wide total emissions. So the next slide is similar. We're going to look at trends, and just like on the internal side, when we look at the community side, we don't have a trend line for those embodied emissions that are referred there to as materials. That includes food. So looking at the trends, we're headed downward on electricity use, which is the top blue line, natural gas use, which is the next one down, the red line, and transportation fuel use, the black line. They're all headed downward. Electricity use fell about 15% between 2000 and 2013. Natural gas use fell more than 12% between 2006 and 2012. And gasoline and diesel consumption dropped by more than 19% between 2004 and 2013. So we're seeing some pretty significant reductions. From a greenhouse gas perspective, this is great news. It is worth noting that here's a line for 2008, that these trends began before the economic downturn of 2008. But certainly the economic downturn has contributed to some of these reductions, and nobody wants to see us meet our greenhouse gas goals on the backs of economic hardship. So certainly that is a piece of this, but when we look at economic trends here locally, we're starting to rebound somewhat, and our energy use continues to move in the long term downward. So just a few more slides, or two more slides here. A couple comments on next steps. After reviewing these trends, there's discussion internally that it makes sense for us to focus first on our internal energy use, because we have greater influence over those that energy use, because we spend quite a bit on energy, and so to the extent that we reduce energy use, we save dollars and manage our dollars responsibly. And finally, by addressing our internal energy use first, we lead by example, and we can show others that this can be done. So there's a strong desire to focus on the internal energy use first. The other step that we're going to be taking here in the very near term is to conduct an opportunity analysis for both internal and community emissions, just trying to really do some closer look at, take a closer look at what kind of reductions we can get from a number of specific actions. We do have an internal climate action plan and a community climate action plan on the books, and they're a great place for us to look at what kind of strategies we have still to do, and we can do some work to understand what kind of emissions reductions we can get from those. We haven't done that on the community side, but we'll take a stab at that over the coming months. A reminder also that when we look at community-wide emissions reductions, it's obviously not just the City of Eugene, right? There are a number of players here who are required to help us meet those targets. So there's a lot of work there to engage partners and continue to work with those partners that we work with to make sure that we can stay on track to meet the targets. And naturally, there are many more that could be added here. This is not comprehensive. Yeah, right. City of Springfield, though our targets are Eugene specific, but yes, Springfield's certainly a part of this. And finally, we have another check-in set up to meet with you all after summer break. We've got a lot of work ahead, and we'll be back with you then. And we'll be talking at that point about benchmarks and targets. So you've asked us to come back to you and talk about benchmarks and targets on the way down, and also to provide you with a proposal for a new community greenhouse gas goal based on meeting 350 parts per million. So that's something that we'll bring back to you later next summer. And then finally, we'll also bring back a suite of actions to get us on track to reach the climate goals for city operations. So that's all I have to share with you, and the rest of the time for conversation.
Thank you, Matt. I noticed on the status of the Community Climate and Energy Action Plan, I'm pleased to see some things in our progress report have been completed. Some are in progress, and some are just getting started, but that's action. 15% have no movement. Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah, there are a number of actions that either take quite a bit of time to implement, or that are just that are lower on the priority list. We also don't have direct control over all the actions. So especially on the community side, there are a number of actions there that are not either not ours alone or not ours at all to push forward. So we work with partners to try and get those things done, but have no control over the other institutions.
The other question I had, and I know you're aware of this, I'm just mentioning it because we've done so much work with our livability grant and that consortium, and we've done a lot of work on scenario planning, which is mostly aimed at transportation, reducing transportation. But the scenario one in particular gives us a toolbox to use to move levers to see how much we can move the dial, so to speak. And it seems like to me, and I'm sure you will come back with some of the, because we are supposed to figure out with our partners at the MPC level, what we don't have to, we're not required, we have to do the toolbox, we don't have to use it. But I feel sure that we want to as a City of Eugene. So the question we will need some guidance on sooner than later is what levers we want to try to move to reach those transportation things. And that, I don't know how soon we're going to need to respond to that, but we are going to need to respond to it relative in the, do you remember the date or anything?
It's coming up.
Anyway,
I believe that's coming to you in March, if I'm not mistaken, at least an update on that process.
Mm-hmm. Right,
Yeah.
along with.
So I will provide some high praise for the folks at Lane Council of Governments who are doing that project. It's a tremendous amount of work, and they manage a huge amount of information and trying to provide information that helps those of you making decisions like this. And actually, there's been some work done. I'm going to really quickly show a slide here. So just as a reference for something to think about there, they've done a comparison of what kind of reductions do we get from different scenarios as it compares to Climate Recovery Ordinance. So on the right-hand side there, you can see the reductions that are called for, 50% by 2030. And the reference case scenario, which is implementing all of our existing policies policies and plans would get us about 37% reduction over that same time frame. So, it's definitely headed in the right direction, and the other couple scenarios there getting us much closer. So it's within the realm of possibility, certainly, to meet these reductions but this is transportation alone.
Right.
But this information is available to our city planners, but also LCOG staff, as I mentioned. We're thinking the same way you are and trying to figure out how we can take best advantage of that effort and that tool to help inform.
Get these things working together.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. The other thing for me is that it would be interesting, and I don't know how we think about doing that, but in terms of your supply chain, doing that in something way that's sort of similar to figuring out what those levers are that can move the supply chain and a toolbox of some kind around that as well.
Yes, and I would mention that Heather Nelson, who was formerly in our finance department, did some great work trying to figure out exactly that. What are the big pieces specifically? She was dialing in on what are the top 5 categories of expenditures that we have, and infrastructure construction is a big one. Pool chemicals, it turns out, are very greenhouse gas intensive. So there were a number of things, and she identified those to get us headed in the right direction so we would have a sense of some of those decisions that we make that have a greater influence on the supply chain.
The only other thing I would add is that I note that we all get each of us has our own different governments and our different responsibilities, and we may react to things similarly or we may react to things differently. But one thing I do know is that we all react to where the money is. So to the extent that the state and other places that we get our dollars from move us in this direction, that will have much more to do whether we all end up going in the same direction, I think. So just my observation is when the state said, we're going to give you dollars to do this, then we all do it because we want access to those dollars to help us do other things. So we just have to keep our eyes on how that works together all the time and figure out in the other things we've said, we don't care whether you do it because you get good economic results or you do it because you're trying to be a good citizen. Either way, if you do the same thing, it gets us to the same result. So.
And on that note, I would mention that the work that you all have done to prioritize road maintenance is squarely in that camp. We save dollars because we're repairing or maintaining instead of rebuilding. Similarly, we save all the greenhouse gas emissions that would go into rebuilding a road by maintaining it instead. So, the investments you've made to save dollars save us greenhouse gas emissions on that supply chain side as well.
So I've got Alan and Mike in the queue. Alan and Claire.
Yeah, part of my rationale for proposing a climate recovery ordinance was to ensure that as a city organization and a city, we take it seriously the need to meet our goals and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. The science is absolutely clear. The impacts can be disastrous and harsh on our local economy as well as the world, and it's very consistent with what the people of Eugene want us to be doing. And while I thought the report was well done, I was actually kind of disturbed but not surprised by this report. In the 5 years that we've had the Climate and Energy Action Plan, according to the EIS on page 10 in our packet and 16 of the report, we've only completed 12% of the plan items in 5 years. That's pretty dismal, actually. And 15% haven't even been acted on. We've started a lot of stuff, but we haven't got a lot of results yet. On page 7 of the report, there's a graph that shows the energy use that we have seen over the last couple of years, and over the last 5 years, basically kind of flat, and then we're in a pretty steep slope to get to the targets. And then from the report, we haven't done a greenhouse gas inventory in 10 years. 2005 data was the last time we did it. So disappointing but not surprising, which is that we're not even close to being on track to meeting our goals. And when the EIS also says that a lot of this low-hanging fruit opportunities have already been done, and that the next ones are going to be tougher to do. I actually question that assertion. In my professional life, what I do is I go around to agencies all over the West and work with them on energy management plans to do exactly this stuff. And unless they've done the city's done a comprehensive assessment of all of the departments and all of the systems, this type of anecdotal statement that the low-hanging fruit's already gone is something I usually hear when I go into agencies and then find millions of dollars worth of savings that are net savings to the organizations. And I find that what's missing in there is the political will and the organizational commitment to get it done. And it seems to me that this type of statement comes out actually a paradigm that's actually incorrect, which is that this stuff is hard to do and very expensive. In fact, it's pretty easy to find and net cost effective, meaning it creates savings, especially in the early years of all this stuff. And it will help our bottom line and meet our goals. So finally,
You want another round?
Well, yeah, I do.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks, guys, for the report. Appreciate the work very much. When you mention the supply chain issue and you talk about road construction, that's more than just what is done by internal folk, and this is the internal measurement I'm referring to, internally by public works staff. That's all of the things that we contract for through other outside companies that do work for the city, right?
That's right.
Help me understand, because I thought the transportation number was interesting. That includes all of the fuels that we have for fleet vehicles, fire department, and all of the things that we do internally when we buy gasoline.
That's right.
Where does the airport fit in this, and with regard to fuels?
That's a great question. I was just looking at the LCOG inventory, and it does not include airport transportation as a piece of that analysis.
So the fuels, the jet fuel that we purchase through what the city's owned airport, we're not even measuring with the internal numbers?
That's correct. I'm telling you that the LCOG inventory that was done in 2010 doesn't include that. So yes, we can and will do an analysis of that so we can share those figures. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as it seems to just measure the fuel. Then you have to apportion it by the number of travel miles that are done by Eugenians versus not Eugenians, which becomes a little tricky. So it's not as simple as.
So we're not measuring that yet.
Well, we are. No, the airport is measuring that. It's just not included in this report at this time.
Okay. Yeah, I got it. One other question that's just a side issue, and I ask it of you guys because of the contracting and consulting and the work that the city does. I'm less educated about some of the work of the Sustainability Commission in this regard. I want to ask this carefully. Does the City of Eugene have contracts or agreements for doing work planning or consulting with any of the firms mentioned in a lot of the news stories around our governor or our former governor now?
I don't know. I don't know what firms are mentioned surrounding the governor, but I can get back to you and answer that question.
I'd really like to know the answer to that.
Sure.
Thank you, sir, very much.
Claire?
Thank you. So just to clarify, the fuel at the airport isn't owned by the city. It's run by, there are concessions out there that purchase the fuel and then sell it to the people who operate on the airport property, and presumably we purchase city fuel for the city vehicles that are out there operating the airport, or we have a reserve for ourselves along those lines. Plus there's a fire station out there. But what I wanted to ask about was also about the supply chain costs, and I wasn't quite sure if I was interpreting what you were referring to there correctly. It sounded like you were saying as we look at our total emissions, we are also considering emissions that are generated perhaps in other communities to create things that we then bring here and use in our local community. Is that correct?
Correct, yep.
Okay, and I think that's good, and not all cities do it that way that are looking at these things. Some of them talk about the emissions that they've reduced, but they've actually are looking at manufacturing things in China, and then they don't count the things that come into their community from China because the emissions don't happen in their community. So I think this is a much more honest way for us to look at how we are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and not pretending that the things we happen to purchase outside of our community don't contribute to that dynamic. So I applaud wherever that decision came from, whether it was the Sustainability Commission or staff, to take that approach. So that was my one technical question. I really appreciate the report, and I'm really looking forward to when you come back and have some specific action items that we can look at and mull over and see where we can continue to do this good work. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks.
So, I had a question about, Alan mentioned the low-hanging fruit is a comprehensive citywide study. Have we done a comprehensive citywide study of where we could see the reductions, I think it is?
As far as internal energy use, is that what you're referring to?
We have.
So on the internal side, yes, we have staff at facilities who do energy management. They've had a program there for almost 2 decades now, doing just that work, looking at internal energy use. How their practices in doing that, I can't speak to that, unfortunately. But we do have staff who are taking a look at where the next opportunities are and making decisions about what kind of investments pay back.
I would be interested whether we give any message about what our goals are in our contracting as well.
So, right, within our purchases, are we being clear about our intent to reduce emissions? There is some effort, yes, in that direction. Certainly, there's more that can be done to be clear about the requirements or the interest in reducing emissions associated with contracts.
So, the other thing I want to say is I know that we've got steep goals to reach here, and I know that the wheels move awfully slowly sometimes, and so I recognize that. But I do want to say that if you add up all the progress that is either started in process or completed, it ends up at being 85%. So that is different than nothing's happening, in my view. Betty.
And can I just add that that's based on the information we had at 2012. We haven't gone and looked action by action since 2012, so that's not perfectly current, but yes.
Betty?
Thank you. Yes, I have a few comments. In the previous session, we were talking about bike and ped paths, and that's certainly related to reducing energy consumption, I think. And maybe one of the best things we could do is to make it easier for people to move about without. I noticed you on page 12 of the report, 50% of emissions associated with goods and food, and that's certainly related to the proximity of agricultural lands. Right?
It turns out that when we look at food specifically, that there's only a relatively small proportion, about 10% of those emissions that come from moving the food around. It tends to be more about how the food's produced and what type of food it is than actually moving the food. Transportation is a piece of it, but not an overwhelming majority of it.
Well, if we get rid of the agricultural lands that are close to the city, then we will be using more energy to get food to the city.
Potentially. At this point, the bulk of our food comes from Portland and San Francisco via I-5. There's actually a fairly small proportion that's sourced locally.
The farms?
I'm not disagreeing with you that has an impact. I'm just saying that in the grand scheme, it's not a.
But maybe our goal should be to get more of it closer than from San Francisco. Electricity use. Do you think the decline is attributable to our climate plan
Are we talking about the internal or community-wide?
Community-wide, you said electricity use has gone down.
Right. So there are a couple of things there. We've had several warmer years in the past several years. We've had a reduction in some industrial uses. In 2008 in particular, right, we lost Hynix, and certainly they were using a good amount of electricity. And the other part is that EWEB has been very aggressive on doing conservation actions to help reduce the amount of electricity use. Exactly which parts are the biggest, I'm not sure I could tell you. But
And raising the rates. That's my comment. Well, if the population increases, then we'll be going in the other direction, won't we?
Interesting, because our population over the last 8 years has increased by 13%, but our community-wide energy continues to decline. So actually, when we look at transportation fuel use, over the last 8 years, we've seen 25% per capita reductions in transportation fuel use. So we're going down even though our population is going up.
And have you, has the Sustainability Commission considered the ratio of single-family housing to multifamily and the effect that would have?
That's a great question. When we look at housing in particular, multifamily housing and smaller homes tend to have a much smaller footprint than single-family homes, and particularly large single-family homes. So it would have an impact on our overall community energy use, yes.
So it's probably something we should be considering. And expansion of the urban growth boundary is certainly going to lead to more transportation costs. That's a comment. You don't have to answer.
All right.
Okay, thanks.
Chris?
Thank you. Very interesting in terms of what you're trying to accomplish, and oftentimes we talk about doing things like this in terms of their cost benefit. But the one that's interesting to me in terms of how we approach this is probably, for me, better expressed as a sacrifice benefit ratio. What are the sacrifices that we have to make in order to achieve the benefit that we've outlined? And I think as a community, we really have to wrestle with what are the sacrifices that we want or should make in order to reach these ambitious goals, because they are ambitious goals. And when thinking about what those sacrifices might be, for me, there would be sacrifices we make based on inefficiency. I think this is kind of what Alan is getting at. He goes into an organization and finds a lot of inefficiency. Those are sacrifices that there should be no problem making those sacrifices. We shouldn't be doing it in the first place. There may be other sacrifices we have to make that would be a matter of convenience. You know, don't drive your car to the end of the driveway to pick up your paper and then pull it back into your garage. Or, you know, something like that. Where, yeah, it's a matter of convenience. And if you give that up, you're not giving up a lot, but the benefit really pays off. The question for me, though, in order to reach these ambitious goals, might be other kinds of sacrifices which might be more structural. We talk about materials and the production of goods and services. And what sacrifices would be made in those areas where we actually stop producing goods or stop delivering them, which might affect the economy in order to achieve that? I don't think that's something that any of us here want to have to go to. So for me, the challenge and the creativity is, how can we meet these ambitious goals by approaching the sacrifices as inefficiency sacrifices, or maybe a few inconvenience sacrifices, but not to delve into the role of having to make structural sacrifices that could actually affect the quality of life or the productivity or the economic well-being of the community. And I don't have an answer for it. It's really more of a question. Can we get to these ambitious goals by making the kinds of sacrifices that we can live with and that we can be comfortable with? That's what I want to see. That's what I would like to get to. And my curiosity is, what creative thinking do we need to utilize? New technologies, new ways of approaching things, new things we can do that will keep the sacrifices that we make reasonable, manageable, and ones we can live with, as opposed to something that may have a deeper consequence for us.
And I would just make the comment that we'll be coming back to you after your summer break and talking about some of those specific actions that will get us different reductions, so you can talk about where that balance is. And also that when it comes to the embodied emissions in materials, it's not always a sacrifice necessarily. For example, remanufacturing can maintain jobs. We have a number of jobs here where we're reusing things or recycling or remanufacturing, and we're creating jobs and keeping down the carbon footprint of those products. So do you want to, Babe actually works with a number of people on the West Coast here who are at the forefront of trying to figure out how do we do this? How do we make sure that we have a stable economy that treats us well and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with materials? And do you have anything you want to add?
Thank you. No, Matt's right on track in saying that there are definitely economic development opportunities that give us a twofer by reducing both greenhouse gas emissions and providing jobs and opportunity. So remanufacturing is one example. I think I would point to some of the trends that we already see emerging with consumers in particular that are going to drive market adjustments and innovation. Things like purchasing goods that are more durable, more repairable, and have a longer life, that might be able to be upgraded through small adjustments or components instead of having to throw away the whole thing and start over. That's one direction. Some of the other things we're seeing on the consumer side that will drive demand for some of this innovation is an interest in sharing. You've heard about some of those examples recently. I'd like to suggest that the sharing economy is much broader than just transportation and housing. There's a real interest in looking at all kinds of shared activities, particularly at the neighborhood scale, things like tool sharing, work sharing, all kinds of things. So I think we can actually look to the market for a lot of the innovations that are probably going to drive the kinds of change we need to both reduce our greenhouse gas footprint associated with consumption and provide new business opportunity. I think there's going to be some really interesting things coming out to indicate that businesses should be looking at a rental component perhaps, or changing their business model to address some of these repair interests. So I think there's room there for business innovation and expansion, but we have to do a little more exploration to find it.
Great. This is exactly the kind of stuff I wanted to hear, is the creativity and the innovation that could be put in place for that.
Greg?
Thanks, Mayor. I wanted to pick up on something that Councilor Taylor talked about that maybe was lightly glossed over, and that's the issue of food security and the proximity of what we produce locally and what we consume locally. I'd like to see us be able to take a large dent out of that long distance, freight framework when we're talking about, our food coming from Portland and Seattle and San Francisco. And one of the things that we have an opportunity right now to do through Envision Eugene is be able to expand our capacity for food production with regard to processing and other things in proximity to our farmlands. And that's the message I don't think is really getting out there, that we have a lot of people that are under the misconception that, our Envision Eugene changes in terms of the urban growth boundary are going to cause us to create more factories and more, lumber mills and et cetera. But what we really are trying to get towards is a framework that allows our community to be able to grow more of its own food locally, consume more, process more locally, and get away from being addicted to the food supply chain up and down I-5. So I think that's a big issue in terms of reducing some of those carbon emissions that we're talking about right now. And I want people out there that are listening and also in the audience to know and understand that that's, I think, one of the collective goals. I don't want to speak for any of the other city councilors here, but I think collectively as a council is what we're trying to get towards in terms of the issue of food security, urban agriculture, and reducing greenhouse emissions at the same time.
And if I may, there are certainly a number of reasons, good reasons, for us to encourage local food production. I'm not arguing that by any stretch.
Because isn't our number somewhere in the neighborhood of about 6 or 7%
Right.
of what we consume locally is produced locally?
That's right. It's on that order. And so food security is a good reason for us to be thinking about local food production. And certainly reducing the amount of food that we're importing will reduce emissions associated with transporting food, and gets us going in the right direction. It's just not an overwhelming piece of the pie when we look at the food component. It's not more than 50%. It's on the scale of 10%. It's there, and it's meaningful. It's just not the whole picture. That's all.
Alan?
Yeah, just to finish off what I was saying was I believe a lot of potential here for net savings to the city by accomplishing these goals, and it will help our bottom line at the same time meeting these goals. So what the report tells me, though, is that we have a great deal of work to do in a very, very short period of time, in the next 5 years. And the opportunity analysis is a good place to start, but it seems to me we're way behind. If we did everything in the CAP, how far would that get us towards meeting our goals?
So on the community side, that's one of the analyses we haven't done is added up all the things in the Community Climate and Energy Action Plan to figure out how much reduction we'll get from that. So on the internal side, we have done that. If we implemented everything in our internal plan, that is calibrated to get us to a 55% reduction in emissions. So
we need above and beyond that to get.
Yes, and the kind of underlying assumption there in creating that internal climate action plan was that eliminating fossil fuel consumption for city operations is a tall order, and so there's an assumption then that we would purchase offsets or find other ways to buy down that carbon contribution. Yeah.
Right. So I'm real eager to see the plan, but I do think staff, I think maybe all of us are underestimating the effort this will take, the focus that it will take, the leadership that it will take to get us there. But I'm really eager to see that. I have a lot of confidence in staff to be able to get us there. I've seen you do it over and over again, so and pull off minor miracles on the budget and other places. So I'm real eager to see how the plan that's going to be developed and how we're going to get there, and let us know what we can do to support that and meet these goals.
So I wanted to go back a little bit to what Chris was talking about, and I know what you mean by sacrifices, and actually it has a little bit of a negative twist, but I would say that when you look at the survey that was done at the city level, when you look at the state values survey, what it says is people really care about this stuff, and they're willing to do some things to turn the dial. And that is, they've expressed that in large numbers, that they're waiting to be asked. I recall sometimes in the past when some big thing happened and we didn't ask people to make sacrifices. And I think people really want to know what it is they can do that can help make this better. And they've said it in both the surveys that we're familiar with. It's just finding the right things to ask people that they feel are reasonable and they can manage, right? So I think there's a ton of it, because I don't even think we've begun in many ways in most places, as Alan was pointing out. I think that all over this state, and certainly here, there are things that everybody could do in every facet of their life. I'm one of them. And we're not doing those yet because we haven't been really asked to step up and help with this in a major way. So that's the thing that's in front of us to really do. There's so much that we do and have that we could do differently and have differently. So, and then really move things in a direction, but we have to actually set our feet in that path and say that's where we want to go, and we're willing to try to explore those things and do those things. So we will all look forward to the next conversation. Thank you both very much.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
And with that, I think we're done for right now, and we'll meet back again in almost a minute.